get to do this.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi, Dr. Painter.
Hello. Nell, please.
No.
I just need glasses. And then I will be with us. Here we go. Well, first of all, thank you so much for coming out and for being with us today. I am really thrilled. Aaron and I had the privilege of at least meeting via pixels to judge the contest. And then Nell and I think we've been on each other's radar, but I know we are Facebook friends. But I just want to start with this and say, two silver-haired black women authors of a certain age with red lipstick, and a prolific young black male scholar, translator, who can actually tell us what the Italian men are saying when they eye us on the street. Black Utopia, end of discussion. There we go.
That's right.
All right. So, as I was going through the two books, I just saw these amazing intersections. And so I'm going to start with this. How much of history is memoir? How much of memory becomes history? Whose memory? Whose history?
Nell, you're first?
Just a little something, Janus. Just a little something from someone who spent a million years as a historian and who has written a memoir. So, but I do want to make a claim for history. I want to make a claim for the difference between history and art. And I'm going to call memoir, which is autobiography adjacent, that historians work from archives, that is the documents and the images and the traces that you all leave. And we work, over the years, over the decades, we have changed the way that we do that work because what is considered an archive has changed, and because historians asking questions has produced more archive. So there's lots of history, and there's history more and more and more, and the questions we ask make the archive and make the history. Now, art can work off history. And I haven't read your book yet because it isn't out, but I've read about it. And I know that there's a lot going on in there on both sides. But art can prompt us to ask questions that we can take to the archive. So art is wonderful, art is valuable, art is important, but it's not the same as history.
Yeah, I'll speak to the relationship between history and memoir. So this is a book, The Black Utopians, is really trying to explore the historical relationship between the idea of utopia and African American life. And it began as an essay, and it was meant to be mostly historical, but my editor said, okay, this is so clearly a personal story, right? I grew up in Detroit, but every year when I was a child, I would go to this all-black town that my grandfather was born in Tennessee, called Promised Land. And it was established in 1870. This was a region of Tennessee where there were many iron plantations and iron factories. And so many of the formerly enslaved people who worked there fled into the communities around these plantations. But I was a kid, going there every summer for family reunions. The weight of history was not on my mind, really. But when it came to when it was time to think about this theme more broadly, I thought about my grandfather's work in preserving the memory and heritage of this place, and then my second cousin who created the Promised Land, Heritage Association. And I wondered, well, there must be so many other people who are engaged in this exact kind of work across the country. There are so many, all Black towns that actually, so many of them are not archived. I mean, there are places like Mound Bayou and Mississippi, Eatonville, Florida, Allensworth, California, which are probably the most documented places. But there are so many that fall in the cracks. And so I knew that, memoir and personal story was bound to these histories. And that's what I wanted to bring out.
Yeah, and the reason I began with that easy question, for those of you who have not yet gotten to read the books, and I hope you will, and they'll be signing their books afterwards, as Aaron mentioned, but you will see that each one in their book brings history to life through different means and brings memoir to a grounding in history through different means. In Nell's...
That is so well said. Thank you. That is so well said. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Black Utopia, right here. We found it. It is a place.
And so I was looking at these different intersections, and then we are going to open up to questions, so think about what you want to say, or what you want to ask. But as I looked at other intersections, Ghana became something that you both really related to in in different ways. Take us to Ghana in each of your own ways. Go ahead.
Mine is not too extensive, really. So, 2020 happens, and I am having a lot of conversations with my father, who, is always trying to think of an alternative to the life that we have, like here in the U.S. And so a lot of our conversations were about the what was called the Year of Return in Ghana, which was in 2019, marked 400 years since the arrival of West Africans on the eastern shores here. And so there was a very sort of visible PR effort to attract African Americans to move to Ghana. And Ghana was one place of many that African Americans were going to in 2020. There were people who moved to Mexico, to Spain, to other parts of Western Europe, to South Africa. And so I've never spent time in Ghana, but it was one of the many locations that that African Americans were talking about, especially in 2019 and 2020. But Nell has actually lived in Ghana,
Yes.
so it's a very different perspective and take on the reality and not just the fantasy of what this place represents.
Again, well said. Yeah. I lived in Ghana. My parents and I were in Ghana to make Kwame Nkrumah's socialist revolution, which ended in a coup d'etat. And we came home. I am not susceptible to heritage tourism, which I see that outreach as. And I also think of the Atlantic slave trade as part of business history, not race history. The Atlantic slave trade was a trade there were suppliers at one end, and there were buyers and distributors at the other end. So I don't have any charming, hopeful visions of the beauty of West Africa and my attachment to it. So I didn't spend much time. I have studied heritage tourism because Americans of many sorts are susceptible to heritage tourism. And the biggest place in the world for heritage tourism is Italy. All these Italian Americans who are, I suppose, assuming that they can go back to Tuscany and find their progenitor, Lorenzo the Great. Which is kind of how the African side works. I'm going to go back and find my aristocratic forebear. Yeah.
So that brings us to this whole conversation about the utopias. Clearly, Ghana, because the unfortunate point of heritage tourism is the slave castle. That is hardly a part of the utopia thing, but the return was portrayed that way. In both of your writings, you have another view of how we see utopia, because we see it through places and people and stories that you bring to life that otherwise we wouldn't even know they existed as part of our heritage, as part of our life. That too is a brand of utopia. So I ask each of you, in leading with your book title and the title of the this session, what is Black Utopia? What is utopia?
That's right. Well, it is extremely hard to define what utopia is. I mean, we can trace it back to the Thomas More utopia, right? But I wanted to write a book in which I didn't have to talk about Thomas More. I think it's a useful starting point in some ways, but I wanted to be very attentive to, specifically, what does Black utopia mean? It's not about perfection. It's not about achieving a perfect state of bliss. And in fact, the reason why I'm so excited to be on the stage with Nell is because Nell wrote what I consider to be one of the foundational texts of, we could call it Black Utopian studies if you want, which is the Exodusters, which defined the first really mass movement of African Americans out of the South after the Civil War. Many Black settlers moved to Kansas. There were many who also established towns in Oklahoma, and like in a sense, that is where the utopian impulse starts. It is born out of tragedy, frankly, a need to escape terrorism, a need to escape economic and political disenfranchisement. And it might not be the kind of cheery, starting point of utopia that we might think about. But another reason I, wanted to explore this concept is because, even though Black utopian experiments and projects tend to be responding to an awful situation, there's such a vast and creative variety of responses to abjection, and I think, in one sense, movement to create a new community is one manifestation, but it's also a broader kind of orientation towards what is possible, in the future, but also in our present. So I'll stop there because I could go on and on about it.
Yeah, I wish you would.
Nell, you've also written a book on the Exodusters.
That was
and
my first book, yeah.
Masterpiece, by the way.
I'm sorry?
It's a masterpiece.
Oh,
so
thank
should all-
you. I think I'll just stop now. Exodusters is, I suppose, I'm really pleased to know that it was kind of a resource for you, because that sense of there must be someplace better is kind of utopian for me, because there is someplace not as bad as this, but it may not be better. And I think the magnificent Toni Morrison showed us with Paradise how that quest can work out. And the answer is badly. So I'm not a utopian or seeker thereof. I also hesitate to talk about what Black things are, or Black people are, or need, or want, because there's so many of us. And we're all over the place. And now, since the 21st century, we have different backgrounds. So I'm assuming that our backgrounds are deep in the USA. I don't know if that's correct.
Yes, at least.
Yeah.
Mine
From-
is Caribbean to the United States.
Yeah, and you're very much on my mind. Also, with the students I would teach at Princeton, who were themselves or their parents or their grandparents came from those very places, from Nigeria and from Ghana and from Egypt and so forth. But their experience is different from ours. Your experience is different. I mean, it's different because you're a different person. But it's also different in the sense of your socio-historic background. And I think that one of the reasons that the Black people of immigrant backgrounds have done so well vis-a-vis Black people of American background is that you haven't been beaten up with the specific American cudgels.
The American pathology is what it is. It is unique. You know, when I think of my family's experience, they came here and they were honestly very surprised when they got here. In fact, and this is just an aside, because for my grandparents coming to the United States, they were coming to what they thought was a utopia.
Whoops.
They were. and in that, we are both products of migrations of your family.
Yeah, but no utopians in
But
my
no,
family.
but because of the whole story about coming to America, and obviously everybody knows streets are not paved with gold, but the whole metaphor and all of that, my parents came thinking that they were coming to a place that would be so much better. I will just cut to the chase and put it this way, that when my grandfather died, and he was a Garveyite, a follower of Marcus Garvey, a Back to
Kind of
Africa
yeah.
advocate, and when he died, we knew he would not be happy forever in the United States. And my husband and I were both the first of each of our families to return to the continent, any place on the continent at all, since the terrors of enslavement. And so we took his ashes, and we were very fortunate we were able to bury his ashes or deposit his ashes into the ocean at that point, Morocco, where the waters turn and circle the continent, so that we knew that at least in spirit he would get to go home. But it was a utopian.
But he would get to go home to the people who sent him off.
Well, I mean, in the continent, that too is something that I have
That's a
explored.
big deal.
That is a big deal, but at the same point, you know, this is once again an aside, but I worked for years on the board of the Amistad America, and I will say that when I think about that, I remember a couple of things. First of all, shipbuilding begins on the African continent. There is not one story, history document of a ship that we can find that loaded mom and dad and the kids or the cousins onto the ship and sailed to Europe and said, "You want them?" Not one. So there is something that happens with Europe, with Pope Alexander VI in 1503, writing his In Terra Cetera, where he literally divides a map of the continent and gives Europe permission, the kings and queens of Europe, Spain and Portugal specifically, permission to essentially rape, pillage, and destroy the rest of the world. And we are still in the throes of that. Many civilizations have been caught up in that, but I personally cannot ignore that that's where it begins. So that said, this whole question of a utopia or a quest, or even the nerve and the temerity to just keep talking.
Sorry.
Is why we are here today.
It's the name of the book.
And thank goodness she has. Okay. So she does, she has. And one of the places where she talks so beautifully, now you will purchase your copy of Old in Art School here because you are going to get it autographed. But when you get home, I want you to download it from Audible as well so you can actually hear it in her own voice, which was my...
I also read I Just Keep Talking.
I know. But I want to ask you about, you know, we're talking about utopias and quests and all of that. Why did you decide to be old in art school?
I wanted to, and I could.
We are at the point where I can keep on asking questions. You know I can, but I would rather...
You've got some good questions.
Thank you. But I would rather open it up to you to be able to hear your voices and your questions and, you know, have a conversation. Come on, that's why we're here. That's why we all braved the heat to get here. So, anybody, who's our first? I see a hand in the back. Do you have a mic? I am not going to be able to hear you. I can say that. But Aaron, if you can tell me.
Okay. Also, could someone bring her a mic in the back?
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you'll repeat the question.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. I will.
There was actually a small community right here in Harrisburg, not 10 miles from here, called Luxton Lake. And there was a documentary done by somebody who is sitting someplace close up there. And I wondered if you had heard of it, and it might be interesting for you to, you know, you're here.
That's great. No, so there's a community nearby Luxton Lake, which I assume had like a black population, but the point is that no, I have not heard of this community nearby, and that I would love to see that documentary. But that I think is, there are so many small communities like this that are just so under the radar, that are not widely known. And yeah, so I haven't, but thank you. I'll look into it.
You know, in the notes about your book. You talk about the Shrine of the Black Madonna. In your book, I should say, you talk about the Shrine of the Black Madonna too. And one of the things that I want you to talk about that so that people know, but I also want to ask you, how many people know that there are shrines, statues, paintings of the Black Madonna throughout Europe? Great. Pretty good.
Yeah.
Very, very important.
So the Shrine of the Black Madonna is a church that began in Detroit in the 1950s. It was founded by a preacher named Albert Clegg Jr. It's actually not a Catholic church; it's Protestant. But Clegg, was born in 1911, and he was a sort of major, civil rights leader who was best known as a kind of radical Black nationalist preacher. And in 1967, a few months before the rebellion in Detroit, he and his church commissioned a painting of a Black Madonna and child, this 18-foot tall, 9-foot long mural, which at the time, people thought he was going to die. They unveiled it, and some of his congregation said, "They're going to kill you." And
Who was they?
white people. We're gonna kill. Yes, kill Reverend Clay. But so the book, centers on this church because it was very much a part of what we understand as the countercultural moment of the 60s and 70s and even the 1980s. It began essentially like as a middle class, like Black church that was seeking, the path towards integration. And when it was clear that that was not like a reality, the church took a Black nationalist turn. And then in the 70s and 80s, it kind of became a New Age institution too. They had a children's commune that was modeled after the kibbutz in Israel, and also socialist kindergartens, Cuban liberation schools, and this was a church that I grew up near, but I didn't know anything about it until 2019. So it's one example of many, right, that show that African Americans have been engaged in the broader countercultural movement as long as anybody else.
Fascinating.
I have a question for Dr. Painter.
Somebody else?
Yes, I'm in the back.
On the mic?
When I heard that you were going to be on the program, I looked up your bio, and you did a book called The History of White People.
Yes, I did.
It's a provocative title. So
It is.
I Googled it, and I
couldn't
listened
hear
to
it.
an NPR interview that you did. And they had questions and answers, and I thought it was very interesting that, I think everybody acknowledges that the concept of race was kind of created, to create superior and inferior. And that race is not just about color, it could be about religion, it could be about culture, and those sorts of things. And I thought that if anybody's interested, the NPR interview was about 30 minutes, but it was very interesting because it had callers, and the callers came from all different walks of life. But my question to you is this: if we know that that concept was created, and that the names that we have attached to ourselves are related to that concept, in a utopia, I just assume that, in a utopia you're free, and you're free to name yourself. And wouldn't we throw off those names that were given to us, just to create the differences that make one person superior and the other inferior?
Wow. this has been a very deep, talking about the ideology of race and about the ideology of history and the relationship between history and hope and autobiography and biography. We could stay here for days and talk about these issues. Thank you for mentioning The History of White People. It's my best known book. It is not, we're 2 books after that. So I finished The History of White People actually while I was in art school. I was at the Rhode Island School of Design. And it was 2010, and I was on a book tour, and invariably the first questions, and we don't have a copy of the book here, but if anybody has seen a copy of the book is white, and it's got a black circle in it with its title and my name. So it's a white book, and it says The History of White People. What do you think people wanted to ask me about? Black people. Invariably, the first questions were about black people, and then there would always, this is a census year, and they would always want to know, this is a white person question, I don't want to say I'm white. What can I say in census? I'd say, well, say you're black. We need more black people. But my point, your question is so big, I can't get to all of it, but what I would like to say, and to reinforce what you just said, is that the concept of race it's ideological. It's an ideology, it's a belief system. It's not based on biology, because as you pointed out, you could use all kinds of criteria to decide who's what. So for instance, it was very popular in the 20th century to talk about racial temperaments. Or if you wanted to be a real high-ranking white person, like Ralph Waldo Emerson, you called yourself a Saxon. It's a big book, and you should all read it. But the point is, as you point out, that criteria change and what we want. And so very often people will say to me, but what's the real truth? How can you really define white people? And I say, well, it depends on who's speaking, when, where, and for what purpose. And I'll just end by saying, for instance, in Italy in the early 20th century, the term that got me going on this quest was Caucasian. And that term was not useful in Italy because Albanians could be Caucasians, and they knew that Albanians were inferior.
Yes, and I mean, if you go back far enough, in Italy, I mean, there were so many clear divides between northern Italy and southern Italy. Mussolini at some point, like it was not uncommon to refer to southern Italians as the N-words of Italy, right? And which was not only a racialized concept, it was economic, it was political, it was ideological. And to go back to your question too, there have been a number of Black utopian movements that engage with this question like pretty head on. So one of the best known is the International Peace Mission movement of Father Divine. And Father Divine led this sort of interracial movement in the 1920s and 30s mostly. In fact, he had multiracial communes throughout. I think it was Ulster County, New York. Upstate, right? And he was this. He was a black man who identified himself as a god, and many of his sort of most ardent supporters embraced that too, but he wanted to shed the idea of race, right? Like we are, I'm not a black god, I am just a, I am a god, and gods have no race. And one of the reasons, why his movement was so popular is because the tide is turning in Europe. Fascism is sort of creeping along, and in a way, like this was an anti-fascist movement, and so to kind of shed the notion of race is very convenient. There are also, are certain sects of the Black Hebrew Israelites, and there are a number of people who identify as Black Jews. Some of those groups don't like to be referred to as Black Jews. We are just Jews, right? And that's a separate conversation. But that there are many instances of. Oh my gosh, yes, Jonestown as well, right? Led by a white charismatic preacher, but I didn't, realize until pretty late on that most of the Jonestown members were Black.
From my
right?
hometown.
Yes, right. And Jim Jones identified as a Black man. He well, as in, I am the lowest of the low. I am among you, like I am Black. So all kinds of, it's a twist. It's a wild history.
Yes, in the Met, there's a wonderful exhibit on the Harlem Renaissance. It's still going on. I think it goes into July. And I'm just wondering if you thought that the Locke and Langston Hughes, they consider that to be a sort of a Black utopia.
No.
That's it.
I know some art history, and Locke and the man who ran the art department at Howard University, where Locke was a professor, a philosopher, they disagreed very much on the role of African art. So Locke said this is the ancestral arts, and this is where African American artists could look for inspiration to know that they belong to a long art history. And okay, Mary Sue, help me with the name. Wrote the book called The Negro Artist in the 40s. He was a painter himself. We'll get to it. But at any rate, his rooting of, no, it's not Aaron Douglas, because Aaron Douglas was just the artist. But this is to say that there were different views in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and to this day, about what is real Black art. I am going on Thursday to see that show. I'm familiar with most of it, and actually myself made a couple of artist books, small ones, called Art History by Nell Painter, Volume 27 and Volume 28. And they included some of the art or images based off the art or inspired by the art of the Harlem Renaissance. So the short answer to your question is no.
Anyone else?
Hi, I'm Andrea, and my question is, I'm thinking,
Head
can you hear
on
me?
into the mic.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So, hi, I'm Andrea, and my question is, this has been a great conversation. Thank you. You have been talking a lot about history and memory, and I'm just would love to hear from sort of the point at we are now. I mean, the word utopia contains this sense of hope, and I hear in your discussions that this also includes the sense of dashed hopes, like there's this cycle of hope and dashed hopes. So I'm wondering, what do you all hope for now? what do you see as a utopia or a utopian-like possibility that could happen?
Sure. So one thing is, in 2020, I was interested in the sort of creation of and existence of, mostly Black and Indigenous-led intentional communities, and there are actually a number of them that exist throughout the U.S. And many of them are, they're all different. They all have different aims, but something that tends to recur is conversations about land sovereignty and about food justice movements. The spread of food sovereignty networks is very encouraging and inspiring, right? And those movements are about so much. They're about restorative justice. They are about feeding people, but they're also about cultivating a sustainable relationship with the land. Stewarding that land, kind of engaging with the practices of their predecessors in order to teach future generations, and that is just such an encouraging, and beautiful movement. And like many of them are, of course, responding to the climate crisis. And it's not that these, small communities are going to save the world, but I do think they model a way of living that spreads, right? And I think, like at its best, that's what a utopian community can do, is to encourage optimistic movement and change on a larger scale. It doesn't always happen, but when it does, I mean, even the conversation about, reparations, right? Like, it's happening on a national scale. That was not always the case, It took decades of work for, actually, centuries of work, right, for that to happen. And you can go into most rooms now, you can mention reparations, and people have a different reaction to it, but we all know what that conversation is.
We were talking about utopias, and I am not a utopia believer, as you may have figured out. I am not hopeful. I have lived too long as a Black American to be hopeful. No, not hopeful. However, there are things that I want us to do. And I don't want us to succumb to the bleakness of the news, the national news. I want us to be active on the local and the state level. Here we are in New York. Mary Sue and I also live in New Jersey. These are states that are not going to break your heart right now. And there are lots of things going. So we went to the yarn store, and on the way back from the yarn store, we were talking about the things that are going on around here. And with our wonderful activists here, Beverly's right here. There are things going on, as you mentioned, that are, I'm not gonna say hopeful. No, I'm not gonna say hopeful, that are positive. And maybe the next step is trickle up. Certainly, the reactionaries and the haters in our country learned the lesson of starting on the local level and bringing it up to the state and national level. So I hope we will all concentrate on what is around us and do.
Thank you. Thank you. I so appreciate your saying that, because I too am not a fan of hope. I think too often hope is like a wish for an express train that goes past the work that needs to be done. that bypasses the need to confront, atone, grow, so that we can all move on. And sometimes when, and you know, I am grateful for the question, so I don't want to seem dismissive or disrespectful of the question or the motivation. But sometimes I just have decided that I am going to reject the concept of hope because of what I just said. To the point of the work that needs to be done, Brian Stevenson, who is the attorney who, you know, has the, right now my brain is passing the title of it, but essentially his Justice Project. And then he also has the museum that goes through the horrors of the American scene, especially, you know, for Black people caught up in the injustice system. And he has a phrase that the opposite of poverty, what you're talking about, is not wealth. The opposite of poverty is justice.
Oh, very good.
And so I am on the justice track, and I am on the track of I am tired of false equivalencies, because we all know what's right and what's wrong. We all know that every religion, regardless of its root, culture, whatever, has as its core one thing, which is do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Everything else is add-on. And when I hear so much of these false equivalencies being raised as though some of the things that we're going through now really have a just basis and a root that makes sense, I don't get it. And I'm not going to ignore it and just succumb to it. So the opposite of poverty is not wealth, it's justice. The opposite of what we're going through right now is not getting along to go along, it's action and activism and being on the truth track.
Yeah, well said.
So, and you know, I started out by saying women of a certain age. I will say, and you know, when you are of a certain age and when you have gone through and seen as much as we have seen in her book, Nell speaks to not needing so much healing because she's not broken. You will speak to that on her own. But, you know, there is still a need for, we have seen a lot, even in the best of circumstances. And to be seeing this country go back to what our lives have been so committed to overcoming and overruling.
It's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking.
It's heartbreaking. It's absolutely devastating. There is such a core of injustice and lies and deception and people going along and saying we'll do it the old way. And unfortunately, because we are historians here, we actually know the cycles of this country's history. And so it makes it even more uncomfortable than it would be if we didn't know. And that makes it even more difficult. So I will leave it there and say, for me, I wish you justice and a place of peace within. To our places of peace within, I feel like Dorothy, you know? When you go all over the world and you see all these crazy characters, but at a certain point you gotta come home and you find that home is the place that's within you. So please, in closing.
Ooh.
I could ask a question, but I don't want
No,
to define what you say.
That was such a beautiful closing. Was there a question down here? No.
Yes, I
Oh,
do have a
thank you for
question.
seeing.
If we have time.
Yes.
My name is Charisma. Thank you all for coming to have this conversation in this little town that I love. I have many Black women friends, and we often are asking ourselves, where in the world can Black women go to be free? Free from racial oppression, free from misogyny. And I wonder, this question is for anyone on the panel who would like to answer, how do you think about another social construct, gender, and how you think about utopia or freedom as a Black person in the US?
It's a utopian question.
It's also, I don't know.
Okay. That is the question that for me, that underlies the utopian impulse, because the name utopia comes from nowhere. And I only speak for myself. I do not speak for Black women. I do not speak for Black people. I only speak for myself. I don't search for a place to be free. Maybe because, I'm not a Buddhist, but Buddhists say that this life is a veil of horrors. So I'm not looking to be free. I'm not looking, actually. I'm not looking. I live one day at a time. I make plans that need to be made, but I'm not looking to be free, because I don't think that this world, this time, this place is a place where anybody can be free. That is just my view.
Yeah, and I will just add, in what I have felt, personally, but also in conversations with people who, with Black people who have been a part of these kinds of communities. I do think, it isn't really a destination, but I think existing in community has been, for a lot of people, probably the furthest thing, to finding that freedom or that contentment, and communities change,
Let me interrupt you for a second.
Yeah, please.
Because the history of utopias is littered with bodies. So people make their utopia, they look to be free, and they just find more of the same old shit. Sorry.
Yes. No, it's true. It's true. I feel like let's close there. That's a good place. If you want to know. It's a good spot.
I want to.
No utopia is perfect.
Sorry, Aaron, I have one question, so we're not going to close.
Hi, Afiza.
So I'll make it short, but I was thinking about, what you guys said about hope is really sticking with me, because, almost like a mantra of the abolition movement has become hope is a discipline, right? And it's like Miriam Kaba famously has said that. And, when I think about hope, I understand what you're saying, but I also think about it as a map. And so
Sorry, as a map?
As a map, it can be a map. And so if utopia looks different in Black, perhaps does hope too? Before we just I feel like before discard it as not useful, because it's just, my family is littered with hope that got us here, and action. But I just wanted to throw that out there.
Sure.
I'll just say, very briefly, Clay, the pastor of this church, was someone who didn't believe that utopia would be found, actually. But he said lambs will never lie with lions, and struggle is constant. But if you can get to a place where you accept that is so much further, I think, and more clarifying than where so many people will be. Struggle never ends, is what Clegg said, and it's not, you know, it's not the ideal, but it is the reality. You know, he called himself a black realist, a black pragmatist, and I think that tradition is probably the best we have.
You know, I do just want to make the comment because, well, quite up front, the book is called Black Utopia and Black Utopians. And I think we have to really understand the frame, what that is. It isn't a pie in the sky thing, or at least my interpretation of it, and what I see borne out in Aaron's wonderful book. It isn't just a pie in the sky utopia that these people were going to. These were people who took the mantle of activism head on and said, in every way they could, I am fighting for my life. I believe in my right to life and my right to make my best possible life. That's what the story of the book is. So when we are talking about Black Utopia, we are talking about consciousness. Yes, the history of America, utopias in America and probably worldwide, that history is littered with bodies, but it is also littered with crusaders, with people who were determined to make a better world. And that's the story that he's bringing to us in the book.
Thank you.
Okay, so
Thank you.
please buy the book.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. The books are Aaron Robertson. The book is Black Utopia. Nell Irvin Painter. The book is a huge list that brings us most recently, I Just Keep Talking, and we are so grateful that she does. So thank you both.
Thank you.